High above the dense emerald canopy of the Southeast Asian jungle, the air was thick with humidity and the roar of 4 turboprop engines. To an observer on the ground, the silhouette of the Lockheed C-130 Hercules cutting through the turbulent skies might have looked like just another supply run or a standard transport mission in a war defined by aerial dominance. But this was no ordinary flight, and its payload was not destined to explode upon impact. Inside the aircraft, amidst the deafening drone of the flight, the crew was engaged in a task that bordered on science fiction, a mission so sensitive that its very existence was categorically denied by the highest levels of the United States government. They were not there to drop bombs, napalm, or defoliants. They were there to hack the atmosphere itself. As the aircraft navigated the towering cumulus clouds building up over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the crew initiated the release of their secret cargo, canisters of silver iodide. Dispersed into the churning moisture of the monsoon sky, these chemical agents were designed to act as cloud condensation nuclei, forcing the clouds to unburden themselves sooner and more violently than nature intended. Under the cloak of strict secrecy, the United States military was attempting to turn the tropical weather systems of Vietnam into a tactical weapon. The objective was not to destroy the enemy with fire, but to drown their logistics in an endless deluge of rain. This was the opening act of a new kind of warfare, born from the paranoia and technological hubris of the Cold War era, at a time when the superpowers were vying for dominance in every conceivable domain, from the depths of the ocean to the surface of the moon. The weather over Indochina became just another battlefield to be conquered. The premise was audacious. If you could control the rain, you could control the terrain. By artificially extending the monsoon season, American strategists believed they could soften road surfaces, trigger landslides, and wash out river crossings, effectively immobilizing the North Vietnamese supply trucks that ferried weapons and troops into the south. The operation operated under a cynical, almost countercultural slogan that circulated among the few who knew the truth. Make mud, not war. It was a grim play on the pacifist chants of the era, reflecting a strange paradox. The goal was destruction and disruption, yet the method was theoretically non-lethal. Instead of shrapnel, the weapon was mud miles of churned, impassable sludge designed to bring the machinery of war to a grinding halt. For years, a stark contrast existed between the official narrative coming out of Washington and the reality in the skies over Laos and Vietnam. While officials maintained a stoic silence or issued flat denials regarding environmental warfare, the operational reality was staggering in its scale. The program was not a one-off experiment or a rogue scientific trial. It was a sustained military campaign. Over the course of the operation, pilots flew a total of 2,602 sorties, venturing out day after day, season after season, to seed the clouds and manipulate the hydrological cycles of a sovereign nation. The financial commitment to this clandestine war on the weather was equally significant, underscoring how seriously the Pentagon took the potential of geoengineering. The program commanded an annual budget of approximately $3.6 million. In the economic context of the late 1960s, this was a substantial investment, equating to roughly $23 million in modern currency. This funding kept the C-130 Hercules and other aircraft in the air, paid for the tons of silver iodide and lead iodide, and supported the specialized weather reconnaissance squadrons tasked with playing God with the elements. Yet for all the money spent and sorties flown, the operation remained a ghost. It was a war fought in the shadows of the clouds, visible only in the unnatural intensity of the rains that lashed the jungle floor. It was a dramatic testament to the lengths the United States was willing to go to secure an advantage, transforming the neutral, chaotic forces of nature into a precise tool of geopolitical strategy. As the rain fell harder and the roads turned to rivers of mud, the line between science and warfare blurred, setting the stage for one of the most controversial and secretive chapters in military history. The sky had ceased to be a neutral backdrop. It had become an active participant in the conflict, weaponized by men who believed they could harness the storm. Background: from scientific experiments to military application, 1947-1966. The journey from benign laboratory curiosity to a classified instrument of war did not happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate evolution, fueled by the technological optimism of the post-World War II era and the existential anxieties of the Cold War. Before the skies over Vietnam were filled with silver iodide, the very concept of weather modification had to be proven, tested, and ultimately militarized. The genesis of this ambition can be traced back to 1947, a time when American science felt invincible. Having unlocked the power of the atom, researchers turned their gaze upward to the chaotic dynamics of the atmosphere. This marked the inception of Project Cirrus, a groundbreaking collaboration between the General Electric Corporation and the U.S. military. It was the first concerted effort to move beyond mere observation of the weather to active interference. In a historic experiment that year, scientists successfully demonstrated that by seeding supercooled clouds with dry ice, they could induce precipitation. For the first time, humanity had grabbed the reins of a cloud. However briefly, Project Cirrus was more than a scientific triumph. It was a proof of concept that suggested the elements themselves could be engineered. As the geopolitical climate chilled into the Cold War, the innocent wonder of these early discoveries began to harden into strategic calculation. The logic of the era dictated that any scientific breakthrough with potential dual-use applications had to be explored for military advantage, lest the Soviet Union achieve dominance first. The atmosphere was no longer seen merely as a global commons, but as a potential theatre of operations where supremacy had to be established. By 1962, these ambitions coalesced into Project Storm Fury. Unlike its predecessors, which focused on the theoretical possibility of seeding, Storm Fury was grand in scale and specific in intent. Its public face was benevolent, a research program designed to weaken destructive tropical cyclones by seeding them with silver iodide, theoretically reducing their intensity and saving lives. The proving grounds for these experiments were the vast, storm-tossed expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Tests were conducted with increasing sophistication over the Philippines, Guam, and Okinawa. These locations were not chosen at random. They provided a perfect natural laboratory of tropical weather systems, distinct from the temperate climates where early research had occurred. However, beneath the surface of scientific inquiry, the military utility of these techniques was being closely monitored. If a hurricane could be weakened, could a rainstorm be strengthened? If the eye of a storm could be expanded, could a monsoon be prolonged? The pilots and scientists operating out of Guam and Okinawa were gathering data that would soon be repurposed for a very different objective. The tests in the Pacific served a dual function. They advanced the science of meteorology while simultaneously training personnel and refining the logistics of aerial cloud seeding in tropical environments. The pivotal moment in this transition from research to weaponization arrived in 1966. As the conflict in Vietnam escalated, American strategists found themselves baffled by the resilience of the enemy's logistics. The Ho Chi Minh Trail labyrinthine network of supply routes remained functional despite heavy conventional bombing. The military needed a solution that could cover vast areas and disrupt movement without requiring a bomb on every truck. They needed the weather. In 1966, the focus of weather modification research shifted dramatically and retreated into the shadows. At the Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake, located in the high desert of California, a new project began to take shape under the strictest secrecy. Far from the public eye and the academic transparency of earlier civilian projects, military scientists began to draft the operational concept for what would eventually become the intervention in Southeast Asia. The work at China Lake was the missing link. It was here that the lessons learned from Project Cirrus and the tropical data gathered during Project Storm Fury were synthesized into a tactical doctrine. The engineers and strategists at China Lake were not looking to save coastal cities from hurricanes. They were calculating how to weaponize the hydrological cycle of a specific jungle environment. They developed the delivery systems and refined the chemical mixtures, determining the precise ratios of silver iodide required to trigger massive downpours. This period, spanning nearly 2 decades, illustrates a profound transformation driven by the imperatives of the Cold War. It was a time when the boundary between scientific discovery and military strategy evaporated. The researchers at China Lake were the final architects of this shift, taking the raw clay of 1947's experiments and molding it into a covert tool of attrition. By the end of 1966, the science was no longer theoretical, and the intent was no longer benign. The technology was ready, the targets were identified, and the stage was set for the first time in history where a superpower would attempt to enlist the rain itself as a soldier in the field. The birth of the operation, March 20th, 1967. The theoretical groundwork laid in the deserts of California and the testing grounds of the Pacific finally culminated in a concrete reality on a humid spring day in Southeast Asia. On March 20th, 1967, the operational phase of the weather war officially began. The location was the Royal Thai Air Force Base Udon, Thani, situated in northeast Thailand, a pivotal hub for American air power in the region. It was here, amidst the roar of jet engines and the bustle of ground crews, that the 54th Weather Reconnaissance Squadron prepared to launch a mission unlike any other in the annals of military aviation. For the personnel on the ground, the activity might have seemed routine, but the parameters of the mission had fundamentally changed. This was the birth of the operational phase, marking the first combat sortie designed specifically to modify the weather over hostile territory. The target was the airspace over Laos, directly above the infiltration routes of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The objective was not reconnaissance, but active intervention. The tools of this trade were a blend of heavy transport reliability and fighter jet speed. The primary workhorses were the WC-1130 Hercules aircraft, modified to carry specialized dispersal systems. Joining them in this clandestine effort were RF-4C Phantom reconnaissance jets capable of penetrating more dangerous airspace at higher speeds. However, their payload was not high explosives. Instead, these aircraft were loaded with photo-flash-like cartridges and canisters containing a precise chemical mixture, silver iodide, AgI, and lead iodide, PbI2. The science behind the sortie was an exercise in atmospheric chemistry. The plan required the pilots to identify suitable cloud formations, specifically towering cumulus clouds that were rich in moisture but had not yet released their rain. By flying through or above these formations and igniting the cartridges, the aircraft would inject the chemical nuclei into the cloud mass. These particles acted as artificial ice crystals, attracting supercooled water droplets, which would then freeze, grow heavy, and fall as rain. It was a process of forced saturation, designed to wring out the moisture from the sky on command. Behind the controls of these aircraft were air crews operating in a strange bubble of compartmentalization. Many of the crews were rotated in from Guam, arriving at Udon Thani for short tours of duty. To maintain the strictest operational security, the true nature of their flights was often obscured, even from the men flying them. The mission operated under the codename Motorpool, a mundane and bureaucratic title likely chosen to deflect curiosity. These rotating crews were effectively cogs in a larger machine, executing specific flight profiles and dispensing canisters without necessarily understanding the grand strategic picture of the weather warfare campaign they were waging. The strategic goal driving this March 20th launch was specific and ambitious. The American military command did not just want rain. They wanted to manipulate the seasons. The primary objective was to extend the natural monsoon season by 30 to 45 days. By artificially prolonging the period of heavy rains, planners intended to attack the very ground the enemy walked on. The logic was one of attrition through geography. If the rains could be sustained, the dirt roads of the Ho Chi Minh Trail would soften into impassable quagmires. The intended result was a logistical nightmare for the North Vietnamese. The operation aimed to wash out river crossings and provoke landslides that would block narrow mountain passes. By turning the earth into mud, the US hoped to immobilize the trucks and supply columns that were the lifeline of the insurgency in the south. As the first aircraft lifted off the runway at Udon Thani that March day, they carried with them the hope that science could do what thousands of tons of conventional bombs had failed to accomplish: stop the flow of supplies by weaponizing the rain itself. 5 years of secret war with the sky, 1967-1972. For 5 consecutive years, the skies over Indochina became the theater of a silent hydrological war that followed the rhythmic pulse of the seasons. From 1967 to 1972, the operation settled into a grinding routine dictated by nature itself. The missions were flown primarily during the monsoon months, typically spanning from March to November, when the atmosphere was already primed with moisture and ripe for manipulation. It was a war of attrition, fought not for territory, but for the saturation of the soil. As the program matured, its geographical scope shifted in response to the evolving demands of the conflict. In September 1967, the target list expanded significantly. The seeding aircraft moved beyond their initial operational zones to target the A Shau Valley in South Vietnam. This area was a critical artery for the communist forces, a rugged corridor used to funnel men and material from the Ho Chi Minh Trail toward the coastal cities. By focusing their efforts here, American planners hoped to turn this strategic choke point into a swamp, denying the enemy the cover and mobility the valley provided. However, the war on the weather was not immune to the political complexities of the ground war. As diplomatic pressures mounted and the rules of engagement fluctuated, the operational map was redrawn. On April 1st, 1968, a significant restriction was imposed. The seeding zones over North Vietnam were officially excluded from the flight plans. From that point forward, the weather warriors were confined to the skies over Laos and South Vietnam, forced to respect invisible geopolitical borders, even as they attempted to manipulate weather systems that recognized no such boundaries. Despite these restrictions, the sheer scale of the undertaking was immense. Over the course of these 5 monsoon seasons, the pilots of the 54th Weather Reconnaissance Squadron flew a total of 2,602 sorties. Day after day, they dispensed their chemical payloads, tirelessly working to coax more rain from the clouds than nature intended. The military's internal assessments deemed the technical aspect of the program a success. Reports claimed that the seeding operations had achieved their primary meteorological goal, generating an estimated increase in rainfall of 30% to 45% in targeted areas. Yet, amidst the statistics and sortie counts, one incident highlighted the potential chaos of unleashing environmental warfare. A persistent and dark rumor emerged regarding the raid on the Son Tay prison camp. In 1970, U.S. Special Forces launched Operation Ivory Coast, a daring mission to rescue American prisoners of war held near Hanoi. The raid was executed brilliantly, but the camp was found empty. While not proven by a direct paper trail, speculation lingered within the intelligence community that the heavy flooding in the region, potentially exacerbated by the weather modification efforts, had forced the North Vietnamese to move the prisoners to a different location just before the raid. If true, it was a bitter irony. The secret weapon designed to hinder the enemy might have inadvertently sabotaged one of the most critical rescue missions of the war. Ultimately, the 5-year campaign was defined by a stark contradiction between scientific data and strategic reality. On paper, the operation was working. The rainfall charts showed a clear spike, and the technology of cloud seeding had proven effective in the field. But on the muddy ground of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the results were far more ambiguous. While the rain increased and the roads softened, the North Vietnamese proved remarkably adaptable, continuing to move supplies through the deluge. The gap between the 2,602 sorties flown and the actual impact on the war effort revealed the limitations of trying to engineer a victory from the clouds. The US had successfully conquered the weather, but the mud alone was not enough to stop the enemy. Exposure. How the secret became a scandal. 1971-1974. For years, the operation had thrived in the shadows, protected by layers of classification and the remoteness of the battlefield. But while the pilots could control the clouds over Laos, the administration could not indefinitely control the flow of information in Washington. The wall of silence began to crumble, not due to enemy action, but through the persistent scratching of investigative journalism. In March 1971, the first significant fissure appeared when columnist Jack Anderson broke the story. Citing a leaked, classified memo, Anderson published details of the weather modification attempts, referring to the operation by the obscure code name intermediary compatriot. This revelation triggered a bizarre and contradictory dance within the highest echelons of the US government. The exposure highlighted a deep dysfunction within the chain of command. When questioned by Congress following the initial leaks, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird issued a categorical denial, stating that no such program existed. However, the reality behind closed doors was far more Machiavellian. Persistent rumors suggested that the weather warfare program was being sponsored and directed by the CIA and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, operating completely without Laird's knowledge or authorization. It was a secret war within a secret war, where the civilian head of the military was allegedly kept in the dark about the actions of his own air fleet. The slow burn of speculation ignited into a full-blown firestorm the following year. On July 3, 1972, the New York Times published a detailed front-page exposé by Seymour Hersh, bringing the rainmaking program to the attention of the global public. The article stripped away the euphemisms and laid bare the reality of the 2006-02 sorties. The reaction was immediate and decisive. The publicity made the continuation of the program politically untenable. On July 5, 1972, just 2 days after the Times article hit the newsstands, the operation was abruptly halted. The silver iodide canisters were shelved, and the weather reconnaissance squadrons were ordered to stand down. The fallout, however, continued long after the planes were grounded. The denials that had once shielded the program now looked like perjury. The definitive end to the cover-up arrived on March 20, 1974. During top-secret briefings that were later declassified, Pentagon officials were forced to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There, under oath, the military finally officially acknowledged the extent of their attempts to weaponize the weather. The admission marked the end of the era of Popeye and motor pool, transforming what had been a tactical experiment into a symbol of government deception and a catalyst for an international ethical debate.